It has been at least 100 years since we've seen anything like this.
Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Ben Harris with me, who is the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies at Brookings Institution. Very happy to have you. And we're going to be talking all about the shit show that is the economy. So, Ben, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, before we begin, this conversation obviously requires beer. So, what are we drinking?
I'm drinking a Guinness, so I put way too much thought into this. I was like, do I want to drink what I usually drink, which would just be bourbon?
Yeah.
Do I want to drink a fancy beer? I just want to drink my favorite beer. My favorite beer is by far Guinness, so I thought, don't overcomplicate it. Go with
It's supposed to be fun. Well,
right?
Guinness is a great beer.
I agree.
And I have a Change of Heart East Coast style IPA.
Nice.
Cheers. All right.
All right. Cheers.
Ooh, that's good. It's fruity. And it's not like super aggressive like most IPAs. So the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
So I love that you asked this question. And I think that there's two different ways that this can be answered. So the first is to say, why do I know something about economics? And so I have a PhD in economics. I have lots of experiences in the public sector. I served in the Obama White House, the Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economist. I was Joe Biden's chief economist when he was vice president. And then in the last administration, I was assistant Treasury Secretary for economic policy and also chief economist of the Treasury Department. I've been a professor at Northwestern University. The second part of this question, though, is why are you unbiased? And everyone has a bias, but I would like to say that in my role at Brookings, where I am vice president of the economic studies group and, effectively run that, we're a nonpartisan organization. And so it's actually in my job description to be unbiased and nonpartisan. So I know a little something about economics, and I'm also charged with being unbiased. So that's why you should listen.
I love it. And as I always say, I'm very liberal, but I give everything a fair shot. And you please come at me with all the facts, push back on me. What we want to do is provide facts and information. And I just always stand up where my biases are so people are known and aware. And fact check everything. That's what I always say.
Perfect.
So, Ben, Donald Trump just rated the economy as A+++++. What grading would you give it and why?
I'd probably give this current economy a C-.
Ooh, explain.
We're kind of just muddling through right now. Most forecasters think that we'll be at around 1% to 2% growth over the next year or so, which is not great, but it's not awful. The job market is fairly stagnant, not great, not awful. The unemployment rate is around 4.3%. It is definitely weakening, and we can talk about that more. But for most people who want a job, they can probably find a job. But for many of those people, it's not going to be a great job, and it's not going to cover their expenses. We have rising inequality after a few-year reprieve in the middle of COVID. And we have an economy which is largely based on AI investment, which is a big bet. And so it's quite risky. There's lots of other problems with the economy. I think to a certain extent, we're mortgaging our future a little bit with all the additional debt we're taking on. Some of the structural problems we have with inequality are getting worse, not better. So, we're not on the cusp of a recession, but the long-term problems are not being solved.
Well, it is comforting to hear you say that we're not on the cusp of a recession, because I know that's been thrown around quite a bit. So it is comforting to hear you say that. Now, the one thing that I keep seeing in the news is a K economy. Can you elaborate on what that is and why we're in one?
So people mean different things when they talk about a K-shaped economy. So let's kind of get specific for a second. Sometimes people are referring to different outcomes for different firms. And right now, I think many of your listeners would be familiar with the Mag 7 or Mag 10. So you've got this handful of companies which have just been on fire for the past half decade or longer. That's, I think, really not what people are talking about when they're usually talking about the K-shaped economy. Usually they're talking about a subset of American households that are doing very well, while the others are doing worse. And so who are we talking about? I mean, if I had to sort of draw a line, I would say the the top 20% of households, it depends a bit on where you live and what your occupation is, but in general, the top fifth are doing pretty well. They have a lot of discretionary income. They're benefiting from rising asset prices, rising stock market. They're more likely to own their homes. They might have two earners. And so the top 20% are doing pretty well. And the bottom 80% are seeing increased challenges around affordability. They're probably in a stagnant job. So that's the first question, who are we talking about? The second question is, what's the time frame that you're talking about for the K-shaped economy? One could make an argument this goes all the way back to the 1970s when we saw a divergence in wages, largely based on returns to college. Or maybe you could say, no, I'm talking about since the great financial crisis, when you saw a divergence between people who own stocks and those who own homes. Stocks did much better than homes. Or you could say, no, I'm actually really talking about since about 2022 or 2023, when the bottom 60% or so of households saw their real spending decline. And you're starting to see things like transitions into credit card delinquency, transitions into auto loan delinquency. And so I think the more interesting conversation is why over the past 2 or 3 years have we seen a K-shaped economy?
What happened?
Yeah, so there's a couple different elements to a household's finances. The first is around the costs. And so costs have been soaring.
So expensive.
What's that?
So expensive.
Everything is so expensive.
Crazy.
But the things that are expensive where you're seeing price growth is really different. And so coming out of COVID, we had everything inflation for about 2 years. So everything was more expensive. And I think that was largely driven by COVID. So you had this huge change in the way that we all behaved. You had people wanting to buy different things all at the same time. So overnight, we all wanted, better furniture, but we weren't spending on vacations. We wanted takeout food because we just, wanted some sort of break from COVID, but we didn't want other things. And so for about 2 years, so from around March 2022 to roughly from around March 2020 until roughly the end of 2022, we had everything inflation, including housing. After 2022, it was much more of a housing story. You saw goods prices actually go negative for certain types of goods. Used car prices came way down. And it was more of a housing story than anything else. And so part of this has been rising prices, but I think more recently is largely a housing story more than anything else. That's on the cost of things. As far as incomes go, we went through this 2-year period where we had this incredibly tight labor market, really by any metric. So a lot of people are familiar with the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate went down to 3.5%, which was as low as we'd ever seen it. Other metrics are the labor market, like job openings, highest we'd ever seen. Quit rates, which are a metric representing how confident people are in finding another job, were really high. So we had this really tight labor market, and people were able to upskill. They're able to get a better job. Maybe you go from being a waiter or waitress to running a call center, or maybe you get a promotion at a law firm. So across the occupational scale, you saw people doing better, and they were able to negotiate for higher wages. So you saw really, really high wage growth for a couple of years. In addition, you saw a lot of government support, and people were able to save more than they'd saved in their lifetime. So you look at things like, data coming out of the large U.S. banks and looking at checking account data, and from across the income distribution, people were doing better. That all has changed over the past couple of years. The labor market is much less tight than it used to be. Part of that might be AI. I think in general, it's just a slowing of the economy. And so people are not having as much income coming in as they did before. But part of it is also policy. And so I really don't want to come in and start bashing the Trump administration.
You're not bashing the Trump admin, you're bashing the policies, and that's fair.
And the policies unequivocally, from an economic perspective, and social policy is a different thing, but from an economic perspective, are generally benefiting those at the top much more than those at the bottom. And so just to give you some numbers, Emily, so the first decile, so this is the poorest 10th of Americans. If you combine Trump's tax and tariff policy, they're losing $2,700 a year. They're paying a lot more in taxes through the tariffs, and they're not getting a lot out of the tax benefit.
That is detrimental to like these people. I mean, that is such a significant amount of money. It's huge.
Yeah. I mean, $3,000 is a lot. Then if you're looking at the fifth decile, so these are sort of middle income people, they're losing $1,300 a year. So they're still worse off under these policies, but not as bad as those at the bottom. If you look at the top decile, they're doing about $8,000 a year better, $7,900 a year better. So a lot of it is driven by the Trump administration's trade and fiscal policy, which unequivocally is much more beneficial for those at the top than the bottom.
So I have a just very specific question, right? Because obviously Trump's tariffs have made such substantial impact, right? And they have brought in a lot of money, but it's also cost a lot of money. And one of the very specific things we're seeing right now, which they just announced, I think like a $12 billion bailout for soybean farmers. And that money is coming from tariffs. What type of like cyclical economy impact does that have? Like, what is that? What are we seeing there?
So in general, the way to think about tariffs are like a sales tax on imported goods. And so the rule of thumb amongst economists are that for every 1% increase in the average tariff rate or the average sales tax rate, that raises inflation by about 0.1%. And so Trump came into office with an average tariff rate of around 3%. And now we're up to around 15%. So it's an increase of 12 percentage points, which means you've seen an increase in inflation of about 1.2%. It is without question that U.S. consumers will ultimately pay the cost of these tariffs. And so how much have we raised in tariff revenue? Probably my best guess is around an additional $300 billion since the start of the Trump administration. This is paid mostly by U.S. consumers. Now, what happened was that a lot of U.S. companies were unsure of the tariff regime and its permanence. And so what they did is they actually ate the cost of the tariffs at the start of this. But we're seeing more and more get passed on to consumers. And so as far as that 1.2 percentage point increase in inflation, probably about 70% of it has been passed on to consumers. The rest we expect to get passed on over the next quarter or two.
So things are just going to keep going up.
Things are going to keep going up. I mean, there are a lot of drivers of inflation. I don't think tariffs are necessarily the largest one. I think if you're talking about the type of inflation that impact U.S. families, we just have a lot of scarcity. And so you may have heard about the abundance agenda. You probably have, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And there's a lot to this. And so we started off talking about housing. I think that for a lot of American families, housing is the center of all of their problems. You're going to take care of your housing costs first. And this includes not just rent or paying your mortgage, but also home insurance or utilities. All of these costs have been skyrocketing.
Utilities are up 12% over last year.
It's insane. And they're not going to go down anytime soon.
No.
So housing's at the center of it, but it's not just housing. It's also childcare. So I live in Arlington, Virginia. Arlington, Virginia has the highest childcare costs in the country. Do you want to take a guess at what it costs on average? This is not like the gold-plated childcare where they pick your kid up, from your house. This is on average in Arlington, what it costs over 5 years on average.
Over 5 years?
Over 5 years.
Oh, gosh. 35,000?
150,000.
Holy shit.
No, it's insane.
Great.
I mean, I have 3 daughters, right? So that's on average, you're talking about $500,000 for childcare. Now, part of the reason childcare costs is so expensive are that we have regulation that prohibit the supply of childcare providers. We saw a lot of childcare close during COVID. But so a lot of this comes down to this supply and demand dynamic. Certainly housing is the case, where we've had building of new homes stagnate over the past couple decades. And just to dwell on housing for a second, there's this paper, Brookings, that we put out by this Penn economist named Joe Jerko and an economist named Ed Glazer, who's at Harvard. And what they showed was you have this effective closing of the housing frontier in the United States. So from like 1980 until 2000, you saw a lot of building in places like Phoenix and Florida and various Texas cities. And that new building has virtually come to a stop. So if you're an American family, maybe living in the North, you're saying, look, costs are too high. I actually want to move south where I can afford a house. That opportunity is over. It's largely because of local zoning laws. Some of it has to do with Trump policy. We'll get to that in a second. But, Americans like single family homes. And even in progressive communities like in Oregon and Minnesota and certain California cities, when they've tried to go ahead and put in laws that allowed building of denser neighborhoods, that allowed building of homes faster, and it just isn't popular because once you have a single family home, there's a lot of pressure. Sometimes there's litigation to go ahead and push back on the building of that new home. And that's just a preference. I mean, people like being in single family homes. They like parking out in front of their houses.
I grew up in a condo. It was great. Highly recommend.
Yeah. I mean, and so you talk to urban planners, they're like, okay, well, let's upbuild around transit and areas. Let's have more condos, more apartments. And so, I mean, that's largely why we have high housing costs. Now, more recently, we're putting tariffs on things like lumber. We have this immigration, I don't know what to call it, program. I mean, there should be more of a negative word because it really is horrific what's happening with deportations. But I was talking with a housing expert, and they said that 2/3 of drywall installers are immigrants. And so if you don't have people to actually put up the drywall in your home, that's a real major impediment to housing supply. So the factors have changed, but it's largely a local zoning question.
I have been screaming from the rooftops, and I actually just made a video recently about the K economy we're in and how Mag 7 stocks and AI investment is really kind of propping up the economy in a lot of ways. Can you elaborate more? Because I've read a lot of articles saying that like the billions and billions of dollars that we're throwing at AI, it's an unsure return on investment. There's questions about maybe or maybe not. We could be nearing a bubble. Like, how is it impacting the economy?
So basically, it's impacting the economy through markedly higher corporate investment. And so if you look at the 4 biggest tech companies that are investing, Google, Meta, they're investing about $400 billion over the course of the year in AI. And that's just money that's hitting the economy. That's building data centers, which provides jobs. That's investment in, chips, which support the workers who produce those, although a lot of chips are imported. It's investment in sometimes new workers, training them to use the AI. So it's basically companies that are spending money because they're gearing up for AI. Now, this is a risky bet. So about 5.5 months ago, I had lunch with the former CEO of one of the largest tech companies. And he told me that in 6 months, unemployment would be 18% because of AI. Now, unless we have the worst 2 weeks in the history of the human race, like that's absurd, right? The unemployment rate is still around 4%. And so I think that a lot of the optimism around AI is probably overstated. Now, I don't think that it's necessarily unwarranted. I just think it's unwarranted on the time frame that people expect. It took really honestly decades for us to realize the full benefit of investment in the expansion of internet use. I mean, Amazon didn't really materialize in its current form until a few years ago, even though we all had access to the internet in the late 90s. So it may not be the worst bet in the world. I just don't think it's going to be the transformative technology we think over the next couple of years.
Entry-level jobs are already seeing cuts because of, AI advancement. Like, what are these people going to do? How are we going to handle the labor market?
So I don't know what's going to happen moving forward. I can look in the rearview mirror.
You don't have a magic 8-ball? Come on.
But I can look in reverse, and I can tell you, what I know about how AI has impacted labor markets so far. First of all, we have not seen a shakeup that looks all that different than prior technological shocks. It looks a lot like what we saw in the late 90s with the internet and other, sort of the robotics revolution that began in the 1970s. Like prior shocks, it looks very similar to that as far as the overall shakeup. As far as who has been hurt in terms of fewer jobs, it's really just a small class of workers. It's entry-level jobs, so people aged in their early 20s who are in computer-intensive jobs. So systems engineers, coders like that. You've seen their unemployment dip. But that's a very small share of people. I also know that productivity gains have been pretty isolated to certain instances. So, for example, one of the most famous studies looked at business to business customer service in the Philippines for a software company. So this is not me calling up United and saying, look, I'm really pissed off because I can't get on the flight I want. This is me as a fairly experienced user of software calling up this company and saying, can you help me out? And they used AI for agentic AI, and it increased the number of resolutions per hour from about 2 to 3. So this is not like a whole new society. This is a marginal increase in productivity. So I can tell you, looking in the rearview mirror, that I don't think AI has already shooken up the labor market all that much. But it is true that entry-level workers do seem to be the one group who are getting hit so far.
So wild. I've been literally screaming from the rooftops. I think I just said that, but whatever. I've reached the age where I just start repeating myself. And it's happened surprisingly young, but that's okay. But AI is just so scary to me, and it just has so much incredible potential, but there's absolutely just no regulations. The Trump admin at the moment is trying to roll back state legislation and just make it like a whole federal program, which could get rid of a lot of regulations that are currently in place. And it's just going to have such detrimental effects. We're just throwing all this money at it, and there's just been no return on investment yet. And there's going to be and there's just a huge bet, and it just freaks me out. And that's my rant for the day.
I agree. I mean, yeah. I mean, you should. You're right to be worried about it. Now, what would happen if the bet doesn't pan out?
And also, I just saw an article that said the big, massive revolutions we've had in society, like the Industrial Revolution.com, only increased the GDP by like 2%. And so that doesn't feel, I mean, listen, I don't know, but that doesn't feel like a lot for the amount of money that's being thrown at it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my guess is that that's 2% per year. And when you're talking about a $30 trillion economy, that's actually not so bad. Right now, if you're growing at 4% for the U.S., that's absolutely amazing. If you're growing at 1%, that's kind of slow. So 2% can make a big difference.
All right. Noted. Tiny number. Feels tiny, but it's really super big.
It feels tiny, but, it means better than news for people.
I understand. So we were talking about the prices of everything going up, really. But the one thing we have seen is gas prices decrease. And that's a big calling card for Trump right now. And he's been pointing to that a lot. Can you explain why gas prices have decreased?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that has to do with declining demand for energy. And because the world economy has slowed down, and the world economy has slowed down in part because we're fighting trade wars on multiple fronts. In general, gas prices are correlated with either the supply of oil, which is controlled by OPEC largely, but increasingly by the U.S. and others, and also by the demand for that energy. Sometimes it rises and falls because of idiosyncratic reasons. So in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you saw gas prices spike, and that's because markets weren't really sure how much disruption we'd see. Russia produces around 11% of global oil. So, sometimes it raises for idiosyncratic reasons. But right now, I mean, energy prices are largely lower, not because we're supplying so much more energy. Actually, the Trump administration cut energy supply or the future expected energy supply through OBA, through the One Big Beautiful Bill, because they wanted to pay for these other initiatives. So you saw a lot of the subsidies that the Biden administration put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act get rolled back. So the Trump administration is actually, over time, rolling back energy supply, not increasing it. So the lower energy prices you're right seem largely just correlated with the sluggish economy.
That wasn't a headline I saw anywhere. That feels pretty important.
No, it's interesting. I really do try to spend time with people who think differently than I would. And so sometimes when you're around folks who are in the energy industry, they tend to be more conservative and supportive of Republicans. But a lot of them are just furious about what the administration is doing around energy because they're really not increasing the supply. And at the very beginning of this call, Emily, you cited this 12% increase in utilities. A lot of that's related to energy supply. And energy supply can be oil we pull out of the ground, or it can be wind we extract from turbines and all the like. So this is not a low energy cost agenda coming out of the administration.
That's crazy. You also mentioned how they're increasing the debt, and that's been like a massive talking point. What is the impact on the debt from the Trump administration's policies?
It's $4 trillion, and that's before they're made permanent. I mean, Donald Trump is not the only politician who's been dishonest about the debt. A lot are. But that doesn't mean that he's honest about it. And so I was watching a clip of him the other day. I don't know when he said this, but he said, we're bringing in so much money from the tariffs that we may be able to get rid of the income tax. I mean, that is just wildly untrue. I mean, there's no possible way that math can add up. From tariffs, we're talking about $3 trillion over 10 years. His tax cuts alone cost $4 trillion, and we're still paying a lot in income taxes. So for anyone who's sort of hopeful that these tariffs mean that we're not going to have to pay income tax, that's just not true. But the larger concern is that if these tax cuts are made permanent, that we're seeing our debt to GDP ratio go from about 100% today to 130% or 140% over the next couple decades. Now, I don't know what the tipping point is for markets to start freaking out about debt, but there are some signs that they're already starting to get worried about. And I don't know if that's because you've seen the level of debt increase over the Trump administration, or if it's because they're concerned about lack of independence with the Federal Reserve. My sense is that it's both. And if you look at interest rates, you'll see that they've been mostly going sideways over the course of the Trump administration. You could say, oh, there's no problem. Well, the reason they've been going sideways is because the Federal Reserve has been cutting, and that's dragging down the front end of the curve. If you're looking at metrics where markets look forward as far as what they expect interest rates to be, they've been on a straight upward trajectory. My guess is a lot of that has to do with concerns around Fed independence and having a Federal Reserve chair who's beholden to the White House.
Do you think they should cut rates the next time they meet?
I wouldn't vote for it. I'm more worried about inflation than I am about the labor market. I'm worried about the impact of tariffs on inflation, and people say, oh, the Fed should look through those tariffs because they're not going to go up. I don't know what's going to happen with tariffs. No one does. I don't think the president knows what's going to happen with tariffs. I worry about housing costs, and we're not building sufficient new housing. So I worry more about inflation than the labor market. I would probably not cut rates.
Okay. Let's say you're in charge. You're the president. What are the first economic policies that you would do to turn this ship from C- to A++++++?
That's a great question. So the first thing I would do is address the housing crisis. And that's a really tough thing to do because a lot of the housing discretion comes from states and cities. You saw during the campaign, Kamala Harris came out with the proposal for a $50 billion fund where you can incentivize cities and states to build more homes. I would invest more in things like the low-income housing tax credit, which is an imperfect tool, but incentivizes developers to build more homes for low-income folks. I think we've got to fix the housing crisis, and the only real way to do that is to build more homes. I would also love to take a hard look at our education system. It's just a fundamental truth that returns to education are how you get rich in this country. And it may be the case that being in the trades will be more lucrative down the road and that not everyone needs a 4-year degree. I 100% buy into that. But if you want to have a rich country in 20 years, you invest in various types of education and training today. The third thing I would do is, and we tried to do this during the Biden administration with the Build Back Better bill. I spent literally every day of 2021 trying to get that damn thing passed. And we came up one vote short with Senator Manchin. Getting it through the House was its own. But if you look at that bill, it actually has it resonates with people who worry about scarcity. So a lot of that was bringing in more caregivers for elder care, or a lot of it was around building more homes, or a lot of it was around building more daycare centers. So if you want, it's just supply and demand, right? It's economics 101. If you want the cost of childcare to go down, build more childcare. It's not that complicated.
And what I really point out from that is childcare, elderly care, and then housing are all really immigrant-heavy industries.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so, I really don't understand. I'm having a hard time understanding the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we're seeing. Look, I sincerely get why people were frustrated with the Biden administration's actions on immigration. But in terms of legal immigration, if you like cheap things, you should be in favor of legal immigration. If you like having companies that are successful because we can have the workers we need, You should be in favor of legal immigration. And, I think our country is going to learn the hard way that immigration is actually really good for our economy.
If you like cheaper groceries, you should be a fan of immigration, because a whole other different conversation, right, is the kind of fucked up way that we pay immigrants less than like we would pay, a Native American born person, right? Which is like a whole other different conversation that we need to be having. But immigrants are a fundamental part of the economy, and the U.S. gets away with paying them less, and that makes things cheaper for you.
Definitely. Without a doubt. And let me just kind of make a bit of a broader point around the economy, because you were asking about the state of the economy. I think a lot of people don't realize right now we're in the middle of 4 huge experiments. So the first is around trade. And trade for most of my lifetime has been around, the average tariff rate has been around 1% to 2%. Trump in the first administration brought up to around 3%. Now we're around 15%. It has been at least 100 years since we've seen anything like this. So the first major experiment is around trade. The second major experiment, we just talked about it, was around debt. So we almost never run what are called primary deficits outside of recessions and wartime. So that is to say, a primary deficit is how much you spend after you've taken out interest spending. And we're running huge primary deficits right now. So that's the second experiment. We're just taking on tons of debt in ways we haven't before. The third experiment has to do around immigration. And so in any given year, we typically have around 500,000 to 1.5 million net immigrants coming to the United States. So this is people coming in minus those who are leaving. At Brookings, we've got some talented economists, Wendy Edelberg and Tara Watson, who went ahead and projected where we're going to be for this year, and they think we're going to be around minus 500,000. So instead of bringing in 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million people to go ahead and buffer our labor market to service caregivers, we're actually seeing net outmigration of around 500,000. That's the third major experiment. The fourth major experiment, which is just getting going, is this big deregulation agenda, particularly in the financial sector. So you're talking about fewer eyes on lenders. You're talking about relaxed capital requirements. Now, this will probably juice the economy and make it easier to borrow for households and for companies, but it also threatens financial stability. And so these 4 simultaneous experiments, I don't think they're going to turn out that well, but I could be wrong.
I am so tired of being a guinea pig. I'm like, what if we just didn't live in unprecedented times and things were chill? Like, crazy concept. This has been such an insightful conversation. Is there anything else you would like to address or touch on?
I had all these notes. We got about 1 page into them.
Oh my God, I love someone who comes prepared. Iconic.
All right, so let's quickly talk about sentiment, if that's okay. And this is how people are feeling. And so there's a lot of different ways to measure how people are doing. One way is just to ask them. And sentiment right now looks like we're in the middle of a deep recession. It looks like it looked in 2008 when we had an economy which just crashed in a generational way. And my sense is that part of this has to do with what's actually happening in the economy. My sense is that part of this has to do with misinformation. But what is abundantly clear is that people are really pissed off, and particularly those that don't own stocks are just really, really angry.
Brief note on that. So part of the video that I made, and not to like direct people to my Instagram page, but it's at Bureaucracy Pod, made a video talking about this. 10% of Americans, the top 10% of Americans own 87% of the stock market. The bottom 50% of Americans own 1.1% of the stock market. And that is why the people who are wealthy and have ability to invest in the stock market are feeling good and happy. But majority of everyone else is not touching any of that wealth.
Yeah. I mean, it's really not more complicated than that. And sentiment, I mean, you had this great segment with Dave Wasserman around the midterms. And, I think Dave is one of the most insightful people when you're talking about politics. But, looking forward to the midterms, we'll see what happens. I think it's pretty much a race between, I'm getting out over my skis a bit because I'm an economist and not a political scientist, but But, I think it's basically a race between gerrymandering and negative sentiment. And my guess is that negative sentiment is winning. But Americans are being very, very clear. They're wildly unhappy with the state of the economy. It's up to policymakers and honestly up to people like me who work in policy to come with better policies to make them happier and more satisfied.
Appreciate all that you do for analyzing it and teaching us about what is going on because it is so confusing.
Thank you, Emily, for having
Ben,
me.
it's been great to have you on. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.